Hello and welcome to my generic T2 unit composition tutorial. You are here because you would like to know which units to put into your T2 land unit mix, and this tutorial is going to explain it. Let's start with Aeon, and first I guess we explain the difference between the HQ and the support factory. So when you have T1 factory, you have the option to upgrade it to the HQ and the option to upgrade it to a standard land factory. Both are T2, both have the same build power, and they're going to spend the same on building the units. It's going to take the same amount of time to finish the units, but the difference is that the HQ is more expensive than the support factory. But you need at least one HQ to afford a support factory, which in turn means that usually you first get the HQ, and when it's finished you start upgrading T1 factories to T2 support factories. And these T2 support factories are going to basically have the same functionality as the HQ, except they cost less. But if your HQ dies, then the T2 support factories stop producing T2 units, and they will only produce T1 units. So you always have only one HQ, unless you expect your HQ to die because it's in a dangerous position. The enemy is going to capture that expansion, or like even hit your main base. You went for a base trade maybe. And that would be a situation where you could like think about having two HQs. But usually you only build one HQ because the HQ is much more expensive than the support factories. Okay, so let's continue with the unit compositions themselves. I suppose for Aeon, this unit composition is mainly for attacking bases and adding fire support to your ACU. And you usually use it on small maps, such as like Theta Passage or something like that. Maybe like 5x5 kilometer maps where the like starting positions are close to each other. Because Aeon is usually a faction that skips T2 and goes for T3 directly. So you just build a few engineers, maybe a shield and a flak for your ACU, but the rest is just going to be T3. And you don't want to stay on T2 for too long, because as I explained in the land unit comparison chart, the Aeon T2 units are usually outperformed by their peers, since the main tank has very bad micro capabilities. They all cost power to operate, and you simply get more value out of Harpies when you go T3 and get these Harpies. So usually you don't stay on T2. But on small maps where you don't have the time to get T3, such unit composition may be relevant for you. So let's take a look at it. We have 3 Obsidians, and Aeon can choose between the Obsidian and the Blaze. And the Obsidian is a slow, strong, high mass tank, and the Blaze is a weak, fast, low mass tank. And oh, I can see they adjusted the mass cost. It used to be around 300, now it's 220. I suppose the Blaze just got buffed in the last patch. But you should still keep in mind that the Blaze is not going to be a very strong unit, and the Obsidian is usually better in most situations. You can think about building Blaze tanks when you need to react quickly to an incoming threat. Let's say the enemy is swarming you with T1 units, you are retreating your ACU back into your base, and you need some units quickly. And you were planning on doing T2 skip and just went for T3, but you cancel the upgrade and get Blazes, if it wasn't on high percentage, right? Or you switch your T2 support factories to Blazes instead of T2 engineers, for example, right? This would be a situation where you build Blaze, but a Blaze isn't usually a part of your main army. And if you want to build a T2 army, which is usually not recommended most of the time as Aeon, it should consist of Obsidians mainly. And these Obsidians are low range tanks, so they can be outmicroed by other T2 units, but the Asylum, which is the shield generator, compensates for this weakness by adding a lot of extra HP. And I would say the main weakness of the Obsidian is that they are so high mass and so slow and low range that they can easily be overcharged in an entire group. So if they stood closer together and a single ACU projectile would hit them, then they would all die and you lose your entire army, right? This doesn't happen to UEF players who simply have more units, right? But since since Obsidians are so expensive, you're not going to have a lot of them, and you want to be careful when you use them. And the Asylum is going to take away this overcharge weakness to some extent, right? Because it takes one overcharge to kill the shield dome of the Asylum, and this is usually enough time to allow you to react and retreat the tanks before the next overcharge connects, right? But in some situations, the ACU is faster, right? Like it's slower than the Obsidians, but maybe you don't react in time. And it's going to overcharge like the Obsidians twice. And on the first overcharge, the shield dome collapses, and on the second, the Obsidians get killed. So very weak against overcharge. And yeah, due to the micro weaknesses, also weak against other T2 units. So it's basically a solid tank on the paper, but in the game there are some problems with it. The Asylum, though, as I said, compensates for this weakness. And the Asylum also has the nice effect that we can add a Scout, which is very unlikely to die. So the Scout for Aeon adds a lot of radar range, more than other factions. And it is very nice to have in this mix, because the shield makes it basically immortal, right? Once it's under the shield, nothing else gets under the shield, and the Scout won't die so easily, right? And if something gets under the shield and targets the Scout instead of the shield generator, well, then your shield generator survives, right? So it's pretty good to have. You would always have some flak in your T2 unit composition, especially, of course, if the enemy has T2 air, but it's always good to have, at least in a low ratio. Since these Obsidian tanks are quite expensive, having one flak per 3 Obsidians is not crazy, right? It's doable. It's like your mix won't become inconsistent because of this flak, since the Obsidians are like so high mass, high damage units, right? So this is reasonable. And a huge weakness of Obsidians is that they cannot take on T1 PD. This is pretty ridiculous, but like I had situations where I attacked a T1 PD with 2 Obsidians and a shield, and the T1 PD killed both Obsidians and the shield, right? Just stupid, because like the gun is quite low over the ground, and the projectile will in 99.9% of the cases always hit the wall in front of the T1 PD, which is one of the reasons why you should always build wall around your PD, right? But this adds so much survivability to the T1 PD that even 2 Obsidians cannot take on a PD, which is why the RT is extremely important to have. And even though the Obsidians have pretty high damage, their fire cycle is kind of slow, and they have this weakness against overcharge ACUs, right? And this is why having some high DPS units is good, and the RT is going to add this high DPS. And if the ACU stops to overcharge, then the Fervor can hit it. But if you manage to get it stuck somehow, then the Fervor may also like deliver extra damage, even though the ACU would normally be moving, retreating, whatever. So pretty good to have. And this also is extremely deadly against bases, because this just overruns PDs, and this stuff just kills everything that comes out of the factory immediately. And as in the T1 unit composition video, we also have an engineer in the mix, since you want to build PD again and radars. And in this case, you would probably like build some T2 PD, maybe a shield and a Team D in an expansion, for example. So maybe if you saw the Wonder Flank tutorial, on the side of the map where the expansion is, this would probably be a good spot for a fire base, right? So don't overdo it. But like having this engineer building some PD can help you to keep the expansion you once get, right? So you won't lose it again so quickly. This is all for Aeon. If you put it into the factory, it looks like this. 3 Obsidians, 1 shield, 1 scout, 4 RD, 1 flak, 1 engineer, and that's it. And if you have support factories and you want them to produce the same composition, then you just give a support order, right? And that's it. Let's move on to UEF. The situation here is extremely different. UEF is a T1, a T2 rush faction, you could say, because like for Aeon, it's mainly T2 skip, since you want to rush the Hardies, these guys, right, in the T3 stage. But for UEF, you basically don't have that great T3 units, because technically the Percival is a T3.5 unit, and it has high build time, so it's going to take quite a while until you have the critical amount of Percivals to dominate on the field. And your Titan is basically no option. It's just a bad unit overall. So you would like try to leave the T1 stage as quick as you can, go for the Pillar, which is the main combat tank for UEF, and stay on T2 for long enough so that you can do a large scale T3 production of Parashields later on. And the pillar is an extremely good tool for the UEF because the HP and mass ratio pretty much is extremely good. So you basically, for each mass you spend in a pillar, you get the same amount of HP you would usually get in a T3 land unit. So it's basically a T2 unit that is as high health as a T3 unit. And pillars themselves are extremely cheap. They only cost like even less than 200 mass. And that's incredibly useful because they aren't very vulnerable to overcharge. You're going to have large groups of pillars, and if there is an ACU trying to overcharge your pillars, then you may lose 2 or so, but you have 4 more pillars, right? And that's why, like, one group in this like T2 stage would be 2 pillars, 1 artillery and 1 scout. You need the scout for the vision, the artillery to fight off PD, and the pillars are going to be your like tank and damage dealer unit at the same time. And the reason we have such small groups, like this is not one T2 combat group, right? This is one T2 combat group. These 4 units, that's it, right? And the reason these groups are so small is that, as I said, UEF is a T2 rush faction. So you want to have T2 by the time the enemy is still on T1. And that's why you have small groups. Like once you hit T2, small groups of T2 units are going to matter because they kill a lot of T1 for the enemy, right? That's why you have these small groups. But in order to not overbuild engineers and flux later on, in your main composition, once you hit T2 and stay there for a longer time, you want to have maybe 6 pillars, 3 arties, 3 scouts. That is your standard mix 3 times, right? And then you want to add this flak and the engineer. The UEF flag is very fast moving, much faster than Aeon flag, for example. And that's incredibly nice because, like, even if you don't have a lot and your units are spread out in multiple locations, your flag can travel there pretty quickly and deploy fast. But what's even more important for the UEF is the engineer, because if you're going to add an engineer to your T2 unit composition, you don't want it to be the normal T2 engineer. You want to go for the Sparky. And the Sparky has 1000 HP, so it's much higher HP than your usual engineer. So that's more than double the HP. The Sparky has onboard radar jammer, so there are going to be multiple radar dots on the map, and the enemy units won't know where to shoot at, which even adds extra survivability. It is very fast. See that? That's quite fast for an engineer. The build power is the same of a T2 engineer, but the huge advantage is that it survives, right? It survives pretty much everything, and it has reduced like build capabilities. It cannot build all the stuff a normal T2 engineer can build, but it can build everything that's combat relevant. That is like no factories, but all sorts of defenses, right? And that's going to allow you to quickly reclaim, quickly retreat. It's an engineer that doesn't usually die. It also has a small gun attached to it, so it can fight off some T1 units. And you can build T2 PD everywhere your tanks are, pretty much. As soon as you capture an expansion with UEF, the intuition is that you won't ever lose it, right? That's the idea. And Sparkies help you do that in the T2 stage, and support ACUs are going to help you in the T3.5 stage later on. And UEF is a faction that like specializes on keeping expansions, I'd say. So as you can see, you have way more units in your usual mix than for Aeon, for example. That is because individually the tanks are much weaker. So if you have 2 armies of the same size, don't engage with UEF because your army is going to be lower mass value and weaker. But if you have swarms of pillars, then you can deal great damage to other players. And Aeon, who are still on T1 stage, pillars are really going to kill them, because like the range advantage of the Aurora pretty much disappears against the pillar, and then you just basically have a unit that is double as strong as an Aurora, but it has like 10 times the HP, and that's incredibly good, right? I guess for Cybran, the situation gets a bit complicated because we have two tanks that are almost the same usually, right? But which tank is better and which tank is worse depends on the current balance, and that always changes, right? Sometimes it's the Rhino that's better, sometimes it's the Wagner that's better. But right now, you have a pretty even trade-off between HP and speed. And usually you would probably want to go for speed and build the Wagner instead of the Rhino. But I suppose if you go for large armies with lots of Medusas, which stun your enemy units, the Rhino may be an option. And on flat terrain, the Rhino gun has reduced overkill and hits quite reliably. But when the terrain is hilly, the Wagner has a better chance of hitting the enemy units, since the projectile flies a bit higher and doesn't get stuck in hills that easily. Yeah, so the question whether you should build Rhinos and Wagners aside, since right now the Wagner is arguably better, you have higher mass in your tanks than the UEF player and lower mass than the Aeon player, which is why your basic mix consists of a number that's in between the 3 Aeon tanks and the 6 UEF tanks. And that's why we go for 4, right? And you want to have T1 Arnie in the mix. The T1 Arnie for Cybran is not very good against ACUs because they sacrifice a lot of damage and get the EMP instead that stuns enemy units, which is very good against army, but not so good against ACU because the ACU won't get stunned ever. And that's why you want to have some army, but not crazy amounts, such as for Seraphim, right? This is not an ACU killer composition, and you should probably not engage ACUs and rather focus on raiding with your fast tanks. You have a scout again in this composition, you have your T2 engineer, and you have your flak. Maybe you would expect that a Cybran player builds stealth. Well, stealth is probably rather a special purpose unit you may want to add to your hoplites, because hoplites have a huge range advantage, and they won't be visually detected by enemy units that easily when they fire over the range. And then making sure they don't get detected by radar either justifies making stealth generators. But for your main army, making deceivers is probably not super relevant, since your tanks have relatively low range, and the enemy vision range is probably more or less about as high as your gun range, and that's why you don't need the stealth, because the stealth only adds a fictional HP advantage that happens whenever your units shoot, but the enemy can't shoot because he doesn't see you, right? But for a composition such as this one, the stealth is probably not super relevant, and you may want to rather save power. Putting stealth generators in transports for drops, or using them with hoplites is a different story, or like attaching onto your ACU, for example. But not too relevant for your main army. So I recommend Cybran players to go for 4 Wagners, 3 arties, 1 scout, 1 anti-air, and 1 engineer. And just for UEF and just like for UEF and Aeon, this engineer can build some T2 PD or T1 PD and TMD on the way, and maybe even a flak here and there if you encounter gunships, and this flak is not enough. And I talked to some high-level Cybran players about how much arty to put into their composition, and the answers differed. I'd say 3 artilleries per 4 tanks makes sense, because of the nature of Cybran tanks, which are located kind of in the middle between UEF and Aeon. And their arty is kind of special purpose, so this mix just feels right. But what I see many people doing is they simply remove the arty and the scouts from their basic composition on the T2 factories, and they have like unupgraded extra factories on T1 that are simply building like arty and scouts. And of course, when you do that, you cannot control the exact ratio as effectively, because sometimes you have like 1 or 2 like T1 factories, maybe sometimes you have more. The number of T2 factories you have also differs from game to game, But I guess the most important learning is, if you want to save roll-off time, having T1 factories produce Medusas rather than the T2 factories may make sense, right? But having absolutely no RT in your T2 composition is probably not recommended, since an RT in a good army composition can deal as much damage as a T2 tech, even though it costs only a fraction, right? And you're just going to make your army more efficient by adding the RT, especially against like T1 PD and even T2 PD to some extent. So you can have like one or two T1 factories making this RT scout mix. Maybe even skip the scouts if you have radar, right? But no RTs is usually a bad choice. So again, for tanks, 3 RT scouts, anti-air and T2 engineer would be my recommendation for the Cybran composition. And stuff like hoplites and like stealth generators would be special purpose. That's not going to be discussed here. For Seraphim, the main T2 unit is the T1 RT, and because their T1 RT is incredibly good, and their T2 RT is very high mass, much like the Aeon tank, with the exception that the Seraphim don't have the mobile shield to add overcharge protection, which means if the enemy has an ACU with overcharge and possibly even gun, then your T2 chickens are going to die, most likely, pretty quickly. And in order to make it very costly for the enemy ACU to engage, you add a lot of artillery. And this artillery is good against land units, but also against the ACU, because like the area damage is relatively high, the rate of fire is relatively high. There is some firing randomness that even like takes into account that the ACU may be dodging, and if you are lucky, then the projectile basically gets deflected exactly into the direction where the enemy is dodging, so you cannot always avoid all of the projectiles with an ACU. And that's why I recommend like your basic mix, or like your basic combat group would be 1 chicken bot and 5 RTs, and you queue that up twice, add a scout for each group, and you build 1 flak and 1 engineer, just like in the other cases, because you don't want to be overbuilding flak and engineers to keep the mix consistent. So I see some people who build only chicken bots and 0 artillery, and then the enemy is just going to bring their ACU into the like attack route of the chickens, and an overcharge connects and 4 chickens die at the same time or something like that. And this is super tragic because of how expensive they are. They cost over 300 mass, like almost 400 mass per unit. So not a good idea not to bring any RD. And I'd argue like 10 RD per 2 chickens is like completely reasonable. Maybe even more RT, right? So again, 1 chicken, 5 RD, 1 scout, queue that up twice, add the flak, add the engineer, and you're done. The Seraphim also have this hover tank thingy, and that is probably a situational unit you want to be using whenever you don't have the time to get enough RT to like scare off an ACU, or when the enemy is microing like crazy and actually evading most projectiles, and you have this T2 factory, then you would probably build these tanks rather than the Ilshivo, because losing them to overcharge doesn't hurt as much, and the build time is lower. They're also faster, so they deploy quickly if you need to react somewhere. And that's very much like a reaction unit, just like the Blaze, or for UEF T3 that would be the Titan. Like, it's basically a relatively bad unit overall, but in some situations the like short deployment time, high build time, high speed, low cost is going to be of some advantage. So I hope now you know in which ratio you should build your T2 units. Again, keep in mind that Aeon and possibly also Cybran are factions that benefit a lot from skipping T2 altogether and going straight to T3 after the T1 stage. Aeon gets away with this strategy more often than Cybran, since Aurora and like a low amount of T2 shields is probably more effective than hordes of Mantis. But if you have a map control advantage from using your Mantis early on in the game, then you may be able to like pull off a T2 skip as Cybran and go straight for Loyalists, which are incredibly strong units. So these two factions don't want to stay on T2 for too long, probably. For UEF, T2 is incredibly essential, since you try to keep your T1 stage as short as you can and get as many pillars out as you can. Then you stay on T2 for long enough so that you can afford large-scale Percival production in the T3.5 stage. That's the plan. And for Seraphim, the situation is kind of similar to UEF. I'd say since the chicken bots have a relatively high build time compared to the UEF, going very fast T2 can be problematic for Seraphim, since there will be some downtime before the first chickens are out of the factory. But T2 is very crucial, since the Seraphim T3 units aren't the best in the game, and that's why you want to like kind of get the kill in the T2 stage, or at least deal a lot of damage to your opponent in the T2 stage, using your chicken bots and a very high RT ratio in the mix. So I hope this helped, and see you next video. Going to cover T3 compositions soon, and also going to cover some UI mod special. So stay tuned.